Hey everyone, it's Joseph from LearnSketch.com, and today we're going back to the basics. Going to do a little intro video for the folks who are new to Sketch, the beginners. And now all the content you're about to see is actually taken from my Sketch from A to Z course that I've just freshly updated on Udemy. And for those of you who haven't taken the course, I'll put a big fat discount link in the description below for you. Let's get started. Before we dig in, let's just take a quick tour of the Sketch interface so we can see where everything is and why it is where it is. It really makes a lot of sense. It's a very minimal and streamlined interface, but some things might not present themselves until you go digging for them just a little bit. Let's start with the toolbar at the top of the screen. This toolbar is customizable. Mine, however, is set to the defaults, and I'm going to keep mine at the defaults so that way my screen matches your screen. That is, of course, if you're at the defaults. But if you want to customize the toolbar, you can do a right-click or a two-finger click on the toolbar itself, and you can choose Customize Toolbar. When you do that, you get a whole bunch of options here that don't yet appear on the toolbar. And at the bottom, you have the default set, which you can drag all the way up just to go back to normal. So I'm going to hit Done. I'm going to leave my toolbar as is. It's full of options for creating objects, combining objects, manipulating objects. So it's really a slew of unlike tools. And you might be thinking, if I don't put it on the toolbar, do I not have access to the tool? And the answer is that most of the tools, if not all of the tools on the toolbar, are actually redundant with the menu bar at the top of the screen. They just give you quick access if you don't know the keyboard shortcut, or if you just want a visual representation of those menu bar items, because the menu bar is full of stuff that you may or may not use. So the toolbar is yours to customize. Just below the toolbar, we have the design canvas, and this is where all the magic happens. The design canvas is an infinitely sprawling area for you to design, but we're not really going to get into that right now because there's some more to it, and we've got artboards and et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to look at the anatomy of a sketch document in a video that's coming up soon. But for now, we'll just stick to the interface itself, and we'll just talk about how this middle area where all the design work is taking place is called the canvas. Now, this canvas belongs to a page. This canvas is a page. And if you've got a need to separate different content within one document on separate pages, that's going to happen at the top of the layers list on the left-hand side. So this whole area on the left is called the layers list, and it's how we navigate layers, and it's also how we navigate pages. So this top area here, we can click to see if this document has any additional pages, which it doesn't. And there's also a little icon here to drop this down and keep the page list open so you can quickly navigate from page to page. There's also a plus sign here to create a new page so you can add as many as you want to your sketch document. That's right, as many as you want. Down below, we see a list of all the layers on all the various artboards that are on this particular page. And below that, we have this filter bar, which is really just a search bar plus a little more if you click on this icon here, so you can see only certain layer types in conjunction with your search, or separately from searching. If you don't want to do a search at all, you just want to see all your groups or all your images, you can do that here, which is why it's the filter bar and not simply just a search bar. And on the right-hand side, we have one of the most important parts of the entire interface, which has kind of a weird name. It's called the inspector. And the inspector is what's going to show the properties of the selected object. So if I go and click on a text layer, there's my text options on the inspector. If I click on a shape layer, I see all the properties for that selected shape. And there are properties that can be added, like shadows and blurs that aren't turned on by default. So a lot's going on the inspector here. And because the inspector is contextual, meaning it will change depending on what you have selected, it's always going to give you the relevant options for what you need to work with. And you're not going to have to juggle through a bunch of different palettes and panels and stuff like you have to in Photoshop or Illustrator. The newer versions of Illustrator have kind of caught on to this concept, but Photoshop is still in palette land, so you've just got a million palettes that you're trying to scrunch onto the screen at the same time. So that's it. That's the sketch interface. We've got the toolbar across the top, we've got the layers list on the left, the canvas in the middle, and the inspector on the right-hand side. If you're coming over from Illustrator or Photoshop, the anatomy of a sketch document might seem a bit unique at first. So let's take a look at all the detail and nuance of a sketch document. I'm going to create a new document from the welcome screen by choosing New Document right at the top here. On the layers list on the left-hand side, you can see that a new document starts us off with one page named page 1. And the design canvas in the middle represents page 1. And that design canvas is infinitely sprawling. That's right, infinitely sprawling. You can create as much content as you want. You can go as far and wide and tall and whatever as you want. It'll just keep going and going and going. Now, naturally, if your sketch document gets huge, performance will start to kind of creep down as the document gets larger and more complicated. But we can separate things onto different pages to kind of speed things up, because the less it has to load at once, the faster it runs. So let's take a look at what we're going to be using the canvas for primarily. It's going to be to hold our artboards, which is where we design contents for a screen. To create a new artboard, we can go to Insert in the top left corner, and we can choose Artboard. If you have a lot of artboards to create, which you may, learning the keyboard shortcut, which is just the letter A for Artboard, is going to be really helpful. So if you choose Artboard here or click the letter A, your cursor becomes a crosshair where you can click and drag to create your artboard. But we're typically creating for a screen size that is of a specific resolution. So on the right-hand side, the inspector is showing us a list of preset devices that we can choose from to make sure that we're designing at the right size. At the top, you can switch between Apple devices, Android, responsive web, paper sizes, or you can create your own custom presets. We're going to stick with Apple devices, and we're going to be designing for the iPhone XS, which is the same as the iPhone X, which is the same as the iPhone 11 Pro. Are there enough devices? I think so. But the resolutions, many are shared from device to device. So we're just going to be creating at this 375 by 812 preset here, just in case the name changes with future updates. Now, at the very top, you can switch between landscape and portrait, but we're going to be designing a portrait app, so I'm just going to choose iPhone XS with the portrait orientation selected, and boom, there's our artboard. Now, our artboard doesn't even fit on the screen because we're zoomed in a little too far. So I'll tell you one of my favorite shortcuts, which we're going to be using a lot. Command 1. Hold the Command key and tap the number 1, and it will zoom and pan to show everything that you have on the canvas or page that you're looking at. That is going to be really helpful when things get hectic and we're zoomed in and we just want to go out and we want to see everything, but we can't figure out where we are. Just press Command 1 and the day is saved. So now that we're looking at everything, which is really just one blank artboard, let's take a look at the layers list. We can see the name of the artboard on the layers list, and we can see, again, that we're on page 1. Now, if you want to create another page, the plus sign here will create that page, and if you don't see the layers list, this little caret will let you toggle to see the layers all at once or to consolidate them to a little drop-down menu. I'm going to expand them out so we can see that when I hit the plus, it creates a page 2. And you can name your pages whatever you want. In fact, if you decide you want to rename a page, you can just double-click on it and you can type a new name in there. But what's most important here is page 1 is where this artboard lives. Page 2 is blank because I just created it. But if we go to page 1, if ever we need to move an artboard from page to page, let's say our app is starting to get big and complicated and we kind of want to separate it into sections, you can select an artboard from the layers list and you can drag it onto the page that you'd like to move it to. So now we're on page 2. This artboard now lives on page 2 because I dragged it there. And I'll press Command 1 again here to fit it in the screen. So that's it. A sketch document contains pages. Each page is an infinitely sprawling design canvas, and on those pages, we create artboards to contain the design that's going to fit on the screen of a device. A lot of what we do in designing user interfaces is we start with very basic shapes, the most basic of which being the rectangle, which most of our UI is going to be composed of. You can insert shapes in Sketch using the Insert menu on the left-hand side of the toolbar. You'll find Shape, and you'll find our basic shapes that we have to choose from. You could also draw your own shapes. We'll get to that in a later video. The rectangle tool is the first, and I would say the most commonly used shape. And it might be worth committing the keyboard shortcut, which is the letter R, to memory. And the oval tool is the letter O. I would also consider committing that to memory as well. Between rectangles and ovals, we can get pretty darn far. Let's start by creating a rectangle. With the rectangle tool selected, our cursor becomes sort of a little crosshair, which allows us to click and drag to create our rectangle. Now, much like everything else, using shortcut keys on the keyboard, we can pull off some tricks. So the Shift key being the most basic because it's similar to resizing objects. It constrains the proportions, but specifically as you're creating a rectangle, it constrains it to a square. So if I'm out here like this and I hold Shift, it's not going to constrain those proportions. It's going to jump to become a square. And if I let go and I create that square holding the Shift key, on the inspector on the right-hand side, you can see that little lock to constrain proportions is locked. So if you create a square, it'll stay a square, unless you unlock it manually on the inspector. If you create a rectangle, you'll find that the lock on the inspector is not locked, which is not constraining the proportions by default, but you can force it to constrain proportions by holding Shift when resizing, or you can lock those proportions here on the inspector. Another handy trick when creating a rectangle, and I'll press the letter R to switch to the rectangle tool, is that as you click and drag, your point of origin from where you started the drag is kind of stuck where it is. Now, our dragging is really just manipulating the size, but if you hold the space bar on the keyboard, you can move the point of origin and you can start this rectangle somewhere else, or this square, depending on what shape you're trying to create. Next, I'm going to press the letter O to switch to the oval tool. And with the oval tool selected, I can click and drag to create an oblong oval, or much like the rectangle becoming a square, I can hold Shift and it'll make a perfect circle instead of an oblong oval. Another trick that's really, it works with any of the shapes, any of the basic shapes, is that if you hold the Option key, it will create the shape outward from the center point that you started at. So for example, I'm going to delete this shape. I'll select the oval tool again. If I wanted to create a little notification icon in the corner of this square, I can move my cursor to the corner, click and drag, hold Option, and it'll come out from the center. And I can also hold Shift if I want to get a perfect circle. And when I let go, there's my little circle right in the corner. And then I could just nudge that down and to the right and position it how I want it. The next commonly used shape would be the line. So if we head back to the shape menu, you'll see line has its very own keyboard shortcut of the letter L, and a line allows you to click to establish point A and drag to establish point B. And with a line, you're kind of dealing with coordinates rather than a shape. The shape is generated in the form of a border, but if you look over on the inspector, we're dealing with degrees and we're dealing with start and end coordinates. So lines are a little more complicated than just creating rectangles, and for most of the lines that we create together, we're just going to be creating really thin rectangles because they're more simple to work with on the inspector. It's a little easier to be precise, and you don't have to worry about those coordinates mismatching and creating very, very slightly crooked lines, which we don't want because those crooked lines can be blurry, or those crooked lines could just be crooked, which is bad enough on its own. It's about time we start applying some style to these graphics, and the first and most basic element of style in Sketch is the fill. It can be a color fill, it can be a gradient fill, it can be a pattern fill. Let's take a look at all that. So first, I'm going to select some graphic elements here. I'm going to get all these guys selected on the very first artboard. And I'm going to press Command-2 to zoom to my selection, and now it'll be real easy to see what's going on. We're not going to start with the Ziploft logo. We'll return to that in just a moment. We're going to start with these two bars here, which are just the username and password fields for someone to log into the application. So these are really just going to be very, very light, very faint text boxes that have text in them, but we're not going to add the text until a little later. Bottom line is, they're not going to be dark gray. Dark gray is not appropriate. So we're going to head over to the fills panel here, and you can see that it shows a little swatch of the current fill color. It shows a little icon right next to that swatch, which is something called blending modes, and we'll get into those shortly. And then we see the hex code and the opacity. The hex code is just a code for the exact color that's being used here. So if you're in another application and you want to bring over the color of an element, it's not Sketch, we can't just copy and paste. Typically, you'll find a hex code in any application that has its own respective color picker, and you could copy and paste that hex code directly into here and apply that color without even opening the color picker in Sketch. It's a nice quick way to both paste and copy an exact color from. But we've got to go and find a color. So I'm going to click on this swatch here. That opens up the color picker, and the color picker allows me to click and drag to find the right color here. But let's just talk about the different kind of fills real quick. Right now, this is a solid color fill. That's the default. That's the first option across this little bar at the top. The second option is a gradient fill, but specifically a linear gradient that goes from a point A to a point B in a straight line. It has two colors by default, but you can click anywhere on here to add more colors. We're going to loop back around to this in just a moment. The third one is a radial gradient. So it's a gradient from one color to another, or several colors if you add them to the bar, but it comes outward from the center of a circle. And you can actually click and grab, and you can make this circle larger. It's just a gradient that emanates outward in a radial fashion in the form of a circle. The next one is kind of like a circle, but the angular gradient spins around in a circle. Some people refer to it as the pinwheel gradient. Its official name in Sketch is the angular gradient. We really don't use this a whole lot. I know for a fact that I do not use this a whole lot. But if it does come up, if you need a gradient that spins around in a circle like a pinwheel, you got it. It's here for you. The final fill mode we have is the pattern fill, which is really just the image fill. By default, it'll drop in a pattern there, but you don't need to use that pattern. This is exactly the box where we dropped in those photographs in a previous video to create those image fills. What's interesting about this is you don't need to do an image like a photograph necessarily. If you have an image of a pattern, you can come down here and you can switch it to tile. And if you switch it to tile, you can increase or decrease the size of that tiling, and you can create, basically, as long as you have an image that's seamless, you can create a seamless pattern. So that can be kind of useful. But otherwise, if you're using it as an image fill, you may or may not already have your own image. And if you don't, a pretty cool feature that's relatively new is here at the top. It says Apply Data Images Fill. And what that means is Sketch can automatically generate faces, tiles, which is kind of a weird feature. And then over here, Unsplash. Unsplash is an awesome royalty-free website filled with a bunch of extremely high-quality photos. And we can actually populate a photo from Unsplash directly from here. We could just click Random Photo, and it'll slap in a photograph. Or we can do a specific search and get something that we're looking for. This little circle icon here that was not here before will let us randomize and refresh that data. So if we don't like the photographs that come through, we can click and switch them out. But really, it's an awesome, awesome way to populate a design, especially if you don't have real content yet. You can throw in some sample images and see what things are going to look like when they're done, even though you don't have the real photographs yet. But we don't want to fill these bars with photographs, that's for sure. These are just going to be a regular solid color fill. So I'm going to click back on the solid color fill, and I'm going to drag the color picker dot up to the top left corner. I want just a really light gray, just a really, really subtle gray here. And once I've got my subtle gray, my work here is kind of done. We can kind of move on to another layer. The color picker here, we're going to get into much more detail about the color picker in the next video. But for now, just know that the hue at the bottom can be changed. And as you change the hue, of course, the entire color picker above will change to match that hue. And then below that, we have opacity, but we're not going to mess with opacity yet. Opacity is also referred to as alpha, which is what this little value means down here. 100 means 100% opacity. So anywho, let's go to the Ziploft logo now that we've got those boxes kind of covered. I'm going to lighten this a little bit, just a super light gray. And then we'll click on the Ziploft logo so that we can play with that. This is actually going to have a gradient fill instead of a solid fill. So I'm going to go to the second option on the color picker. And now I'm going to create a gradient that goes from a sort of green, like a light, bright green. And the second point I'm going to have it go to is more of a blue. And I want it to be a relatively light and bright blue. The other thing I'm going to do, which is pretty neat, that you can do this directly on the object that has a gradient fill. You can grab these points and you can manipulate how that fill is angled and distributed across the selected object. Also, when you click on a point here, it switches the color picker over on the inspector to work with the selected point so that you can change that color. When it comes to the directionality of a gradient, there's a button here to reverse the 2 points. And there's also a rotate button so that you can rotate 90 degrees at a time to change the angle of that gradient. So if you just need a gradient to go from left to right instead of top to bottom, you don't have to go grab those points. You can just hit the rotate button and rotate it around. And if it's backwards, you can click this and swap it 180. So that's a pretty quick and easy way to do that without having to manually go and click and drag. Where Sketch starts to get really insane is that you can have multiple fills on the same layer. And that could be a gradient fill and a solid color fill. It could be an image fill and a gradient fill, whatever you want to do. There's a little plus sign here. And if you click on this plus sign, it gives you another fill. And that might not be obvious right now, but let me switch this to a solid color and let me make it red, just so it's super obvious. If I click away, you can see that I have a red color fill and I still have my gradient fill. And you might be thinking, okay, but that doesn't actually do anything. all we see is the red because the red is on top. So think of this area as sort of its own little layers list of the fills that are applied to the selected layer. So what I could do is click and drag, just like the layers list, to reverse these around. And you might be thinking, okay, but still, I'm only seeing the one on top. But we do have the opacity slider, and we also have the option of changing the opacity of individual points on the gradient. So if I wanted to, I could make one point on the gradient super dark, the other point on the gradient dark, but at a reduced opacity, and now the red starts coming through. See that? And I can click and drag this down so more of the red shows through, whatever I want to do. And what that does, it allows me to use a gradient to create the darkness, that darkness that's sweeping gradually across, but it allows me to deal with a single color fill if I decide that I want to change the color. See, I can change the color, and that gradient, the light to dark, shows on top. And it doesn't matter what color I pick. It's really, really a nice way to let me focus on the color and not have to worry about two separate points on the gradient. And the little checkbox lets me turn it on and off so you can see the difference of no gradient, gradient, no gradient, gradient. But they both have now the pink fill underneath that gradient. If you don't want a fill anymore and you uncheck it, anytime a fill or a border or anything is unchecked, a little trash can appears at the top, and you can click the trash can to get rid of any of the deselected or unchecked fills, or if you're in the borders area, the borders or shadows, inner shadows, blurs, etc. So having multiple fills unlocks quite a bit of power and control within Sketch that you may not find in every other design application. Just like graphics and graphic styles, text and text styles repeat many, many times throughout your document, and that's why we want to save our repeating styles as text styles. And we can do that just by selecting a text box and heading over to the inspector, and under Appearance, the very first thing is the text style assigned. So by default, your document has no text styles and your text has no style applied. So I'll just click here to create a new text style, just like we did with graphic styles, and then I can give it a name. The one thing I want to point out here is that naming can be important. You can do yourself a big favor here. I like to categorize what type of text content this is. This is the details screen. And if I have many, many detail screens, this is always going to be the way the title, the main heading title looks on those detail screens. So I'm going to start by typing details slash, and what I'm actually doing when I type details slash is I'm creating a little folder called details that's going to have the name of the style inside, and I'm going to call it H1 for heading 1. So I have details slash H1. You'll see why I did that in just a moment here. Great. So there's H1. You can already see that it just kind of parsed out the word details, and it just says H1 here on the inspector. I'm going to do the same for this little guy down here, and I'm going to name this one details slash subhead. Great. Now let's say, for example, that this body text is not specific to the details page. Maybe this is the size for all the body text that I want to do throughout my entire document. So I'm going to leave out the word details on this one. I'm going to create a new text style, and I'm just going to call this body text. We could just call it body. We know it's text. Great. There we go. So the reason for that weird naming convention that I did is that in the future, if I select a text layer, or let's say I even go over here and create a new text layer, I'll let it just say type something. We can go over to Appearance and we can choose from our menu of text styles, just like we did with graphic styles. But you'll see here, body is one that I can just choose immediately because that's not in a group. But details is a little group that expands, and I can see H1 and I can see subhead. So use the little slash trick to create yourself a folder structure to stay organized. Otherwise, you can end up with a lot of text styles really fast that are all confusing to choose from, and you don't remember what the purpose of each one is. So I'm going to delete this. Let's look at really what's magical about these text styles. It's just like graphic styles. I'm going to hold Option and duplicate this page, and then I'll press Command D to do it again. And why not? We'll do it again. So we've got a bunch of artboards now that all have the same text. They all have the same text styles because they had text styles before I copied them, and we're ready to make some changes. So let's just say, for instance, that this Mont Blanc estate text here was a little too big for the text that was going to go in there. Let's say we frequently didn't have enough room. So we'll bump down the text size just a little bit. And then let's also say that we wanted the text to be a little darker, a little more high contrast. So I'm going to darken it up a bit. And then let's do something drastic, something super obvious. Let's go bold. Nice, thick, fat, bold. And now we've deviated from our saved style that we created, and that gives us the little asterisk, just like it did with our graphic styles in the earlier video. And much like our graphic styles, I can click there and I can choose to update the text style to change all the text that shares this style, or I can reset the text style to go back to normal, or I can create a whole new text style out of it. So I'm just going to choose to update the text style, and boom. All of these artboards just changed, not because they say the same thing, but because they share that same text style. It's finally time to talk about one of the most powerful feature sets in Sketch, and that is something called symbols. And what symbols are graphics or groups of graphics that get reused throughout our document. So there's kind of a theme here. Graphic styles, text styles, symbols, they're all ways to prevent us from doing the same work over and over and over again when visual items repeat. So let's take these little stars, for example. Each one of these solid stars is repeating time and time again. And if I change the style of one of them, or more importantly, if I change the shape of one of them, I would prefer that they all continue to match, so they belong as symbols. And I'd also like to be able to insert them easily when they're needed. So first, I'll select one of these stars, and then I'll head up to the toolbar and choose Create Symbol. And I'm going to name this star/solid because it's a full star. And I'll click OK. Before I do that, ignore this layout thing. We're going to talk about that shortly. Down here where it says Send Symbol to Symbols page, this is a nice way to keep your symbols organized. Because what's going to happen is once this is turned into a symbol, the master version of that symbol, the one that all the other symbols sync with, has to live somewhere in the document. So this will automatically create a symbols page and keep everything nice and organized for us. We're going to keep that checked. I'll click OK. And now it looks like nothing happened. But if we look at the layers list, we could see that it now has this new icon that indicates that it is a symbol. Now you might be thinking, okay, great, but the other ones are not symbols. So what are we going to do about it? There's a really cool feature in Sketch where you can select objects, you can do a right click, and you can choose to replace them with a symbol. So I can choose to replace these with that solid star, and I can choose to replace these down here with that solid star. So without having to reinsert and reposition all these symbols, I can go and put them where they belong. Now we've got this little half star, so I'm going to select both halves of the star because they're two separate layers. I'll hold Shift to do that, and then I'll head up to Create Symbol, and I'll type star/half, and I'll click OK. Great. So now we have a half star. You'll see why I'm doing each one of these individually in a later video. And then I'm going to do this empty star. I'll hit Create Symbol, star/, we could just say blank. Great. And I'll click OK. So cool. Now we have each version of each of these stars created. And if I wanted this to be a 5-star location, I could do a right click here and I could replace this with a solid star. There we go. Boom. Now it's 5 stars and I didn't have to insert or replace anything. It just swapped it out. But most importantly, now each one of these symbols that syncs with one another is actually syncing with the master copy of the symbol. So where does the master copy live? Well, if you double click on a symbol, it's going to bring you to that master copy. And if we look at the layers list, it just brought us to the symbols page and specifically brought us to this little star on the symbols page. So now if I go in here and I do something crazy to change the shape of the star, I'm only doing this to ugly it up, so it's obvious what I've done here. I'm just going to kind of nudge these things so it turns into a fat, ugly star. That's what everyone wants, right? There we go. It actually doesn't look too bad once it's all symmetrical. And then when I choose Return to Instance, now that I've edited the master copy, when I return to Instance, it's going to come back here, and now all of these stars are fat, happy, jolly stars. Is that what we want to do? Not necessarily, but that is the process for editing the master version of a symbol and therefore having those changes take place everywhere that symbol's being used. I can just hit Command-Z a few times and undo all that. There we go. And then if I go back to our page 1, you can see that those changes have taken effect and everything is now back to normal. If I am on a different artboard altogether, or maybe on a different page altogether, and I want to get one of those stars, I can click Insert on the toolbar, and here, below all of our preset objects, we have our symbols. And under Document, you can see that I have the blank star, the half star, and the solid star. And if I click, one of them sticks to my cursor, and I can go and put that wherever I want. and it's just like that. So I'm kind of creating my own little Lego set where I can go and drop these things where they belong, and they'll all continue to match one another, and my design is starting to become more of a system that holds together. In order to export anything in Sketch, it first has to be marked or made exportable. So we've got to do that to these artboards in order to export them. We can select them by either clicking one if we want to export one, or clicking several if we'd like to export several. And then over here on the inspector, the bottommost option is always Make Exportable. And when we click on that, it then creates the exports that we want to export. And you'll notice here on mine, it did 1x, 2x, 3x, 1.5x, all this crazy stuff happened. And if yours did the same thing, you might be thinking, okay, what the heck is all that? Do we want all that? And the answer for these artboards is no. I'm going to click the little X to get rid of this stuff. And in the next video, we're going to talk about what that stuff was all about. I don't want to get rid of all of them though. Otherwise I start completely over again. What I do want to get rid of is the 1x, the 2x, and the 1.5x. And that's going to leave me with the 3x, which basically means it's going to take the resolution of my artboard and export it at 3 times the size that we designed it at. And if you remember from one of our very first videos, the viewports that we've been designing in are not Retina display sized viewports. They're just regular non-Retina pixels. So if we export them at 1x, they're not going to look very good. It's going to look like a non-Retina display iPhone, which is ugh. So at 3x, we're exporting at the size of a super Retina display, which I know that sounds weird, but the iPhone 10, iPhone 10s, and iPhone 11 Pro all have this super Retina display. And basically that just means it's an extremely high pixel count per inch that looks nice and smooth and clean when you look at it with the naked eye. The other thing you might want to do is if you look down here, we got this checkerboard pattern appearing on our very first artboard. And that's because the artboard background color is the artboard itself. I didn't put a rectangle. I didn't put a giant white rectangle behind that first screen. So it's transparent. There is no background color. All I have to do is check the background color box here. It'll automatically check include in export. And now you'll see that the checkerboard pattern's gone. So that solved the problem. From here, I can choose either export selected down here at the bottom, or I can hit the share icon that brings up the Mac share sheet, and I can immediately send it to mail. These thumbnails can also be dragged and dropped, so I can actually grab this screen if I want to share it. I can drop it directly on the mail icon, and it instantly composes an email where that is attached. Another thing to consider is the file format that you're sending in. I'm going to close this email, and over here you'll see that the default is PNG. Mine happened to be set to PNG. You might not see the same thing that I see, and you might be wondering, okay, why is mine different? You do have choices. You have choices of different raster formats to export and vector formats to export. So you could export this as a PDF, and that way if someone zooms in, the vector shapes and, more importantly, the text will all look super clean as you zoom. PNG is just kind of standard, though. That leaves nothing open to interpretation. You don't have to worry about font issues or spacing issues occurring. PNG is just what you see is what you get, and also with no compression. JPEG, on the other hand, JPEGs will be compressed. The file size will be a little smaller, but you'll especially see with gradients and things that have complex but subtle shifts in color that JPEGs will average colors together, and it can create a phenomenon with gradients called banding. You start to see these bands where the gradation in color is being averaged into chunks. It's kind of ugly. So typically we just do PNG to get a what you see is what you get raster graphic with no compression. I'm Joseph Angelo Tadero, and if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. I'll have more great content coming soon. And also check out the YouTube description below for a big discount on my complete sketch course on Udemy. Thanks for watching. See you soon.